Hi there, it's Laura here for Cloud9 Crafts, and in today's video I'll be explaining the difference between Distress ink and Distress Oxide. I'll also be playing around with different types of cardstock and blending tools and give you tips and tricks for smooth ink blending. First, let's take a look at both ink pads. Distress ink and Distress Oxide are both the same size and they both have a felt pad, which makes it really easy to ink up your blending tools. When you open these inks, you'll instantly see the difference. Distress ink is a dye ink which soaks faster into the paper, while Distress Oxide is a fusion of pigment and dye ink and provides a creamy texture. The Distress ink also comes in a mini version, which is great if you want to save space or when you travel often with your craft supplies. The Distress Oxides only come in the full size. Finding the perfect storage system is so important to me. Luckily, Ranger offers some really great storage tins for both the full-size pads and the mini pads. The big one over here can hold up to 15 ink pads. They're also very easily stackable, which makes them even more convenient. I personally use these big ones to store my Distress Oxides since I don't own a lot of the full-size Distress inks. The mini Distress inks can be stored in these smaller portable containers, and one of these can hold up to 12 mini Distress ink pads and also includes a divider. I also store a small blending foam underneath each pad for quick and easy access and ink blending. Speaking of ink blending, let's move on to ink blending. I will be taping down each piece of paper on my craft sheet with purple tape. This makes it easier to blend since you don't have to worry about holding your paper down so it won't shift anywhere. First up is Neenah Classic Crest cardstock and Distress Oxides. I'm using ink blending brushes from Tailored Expressions. These are my favorite ink blending brushes because it makes blending so easy and effortless. I'll be using the same three colors throughout the video. First up is Speckled Egg, then Evergreen Bow, and finally Broken China. On the top, I use my lightest color. Then I move on to the mid-tone shades and then I go back in with that lightest color in order to get a nice and smooth blend before moving on to the darkest color. So just repeat this process until you're happy with your blends. I find that these particular blending brushes offer me more control while ink blending. I also don't need to apply a lot of ink in order to get the colors to show up. So as you can see, the Distress Oxide inks leave a very chalky, a soft and muted finish. And these inks are just so easy to blend and mix by just switching back and forth between the colors. Now that I tried the Tailored Expressions blending brushes, I also want to show you the mini ink blending tool from Ranger. These are round foam applicators and they're specifically designed to work with Distress ink and Distress Oxides. While you're using these, make sure to start blending from the outside of your cardstock so you won't be left with any harsh round marks. I like both the Ranger and Tailored Expressions blending tools. However, I do find it a little bit easier to work with the Tailored Expressions brushes. But both give you really great results, so it's just personal preference. Next up is the same Neenah Solar White cardstock, but this time with the original Distress ink and a Ranger foam tool. Blending with the Distress ink on this particular cardstock takes a little bit more effort. It just takes a bit longer to blend and mix the colors. Watercolor paper usually gives me better results. Now that we're talking about watercolor paper, I will be showing you the Distress watercolor cardstock. I was actually quite surprised since it's so textured, and the texture also really shows up when adding the Distress ink. I am personally not a very big fan of this look. However, it works really well with the Distress Oxides. The texture of the cardstock is just less noticeable and visible when using it with the Distress Oxide inks. And the ink also blends super smoothly on this particular paper. So for the Distress Oxides, I really love it. For the Distress ink, I'm not so sure. It's a little bit too textured in my opinion, but again, that's probably just personal preference. Finally, I'll be playing with Yuki's favorite, which is Florence watercolor paper. And I was quite surprised because it made blending with the Distress inks so much easier and faster than it did with the other types of cardstock. I also felt like I needed to add less pressure on my blending tools. So that's another added bonus. I use both the Tailored Expressions blending brushes and the Ranger foam tools, and both work really great. So this paper really works well with the original Distress ink. The Distress Oxide inks, of course, also work beautifully on this cardstock. However, Distress Oxide kind of blends and shows up on pretty much any type of cardstock, which is another reason why I personally prefer Distress Oxide. By the way, the Florence watercolor cardstock is available in A4, A5, and A6 formats, and in either 200 or 300 grams. So now that I showed you all of these inks on white cardstock, I also want to quickly show you how these inks show up on colored cardstock. Here I am using Neenah Desert Storm paper, and as you can see, the Distress Oxide, which is on the top, shows up beautifully and super vibrant on colored cardstock, while the Distress ink gives you a different result. It looks a little bit different. The color looks less pigmented. Now that I ink blended everything, let's play a little bit with water. I'm adding some water splatters to all of the cardstock so you can see the different effects. The Distress ink gives you more of a watercolored look since it's a dye ink, and the Distress Oxide provides an oxidized effect. So here are the finished results. First up is the Distress watercolor cardstock. On the left is Distress ink, and on the right is Distress Oxide. The texture shows up a lot when using it with Distress ink. You could try to use the non-textured side of the paper though. But of all the cardstocks I tried, this is probably my least favorite. Next is the Florence watercolor paper, which is my favorite for both Distress ink and Distress Oxide. You also get a great watercolored effect when mixing it with water. I use both the Tailored Expressions blending brushes and the Ranger ink blending tools. And as you can see, there's not a visible difference, so both tools work great. Finally is Neenah's Solar White card, which works great with Distress Oxide, but requires a little bit more effort for the Distress ink. Overall, I would probably recommend the Florence watercolor paper for the Distress ink, and either Neenah Solar White or Florence watercolor paper for Distress Oxides. I also want to quickly mention that Neenah Solar White cardstock works great with Copic markers as well. So this cardstock is not only Distress Oxide and Distress ink friendly, but also alcohol marker friendly, which is another added bonus. Here's also another quick look at these inks on colored cardstock. As you can see, Distress Oxide shows up more pigmented than Distress ink. Alright, that's it, the difference between Distress ink and Distress Oxide. I hope you find this video helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and we'll do our best answering it quickly as possible. Thank you so much for stopping by. We will see you again very soon. Bye bye.